John Pierpont Morgan was an American financier and banker who dominated corporate finance on Wall Street throughout the Golden Age. As the head of the banking firm that ultimately became known as J.P. Morgan & Company, he was a driving force behind the wave of industrial consolidation in the United States spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Morgan was born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut, and was the son of Junius Spencer Morgan and Juliette Pierpont of the influential Morgan family. Pierpont, as he preferred to be known, had a diverse education thanks to his father. In the fall of 1848, he transferred to the Hartford Public School, then to the Episcopal Academy in Cheshire, Connecticut, now Cheshire Academy. In September 1851, he passed the entrance exam for the English High School of Boston, which specialized in mathematics for careers in commerce. In April 1852, an illness struck Morgan which became more common as his life progressed. Rheumatic fever left him in such pain that he could not walk, and Junius sent him to the Azores to recover. He stayed there for almost a year until he recovered and then returned to Boston to resume his studies. After graduation, his father sent him to Bellerive, a school in the Swiss village of La Tour-de-Pales, where he gained fluency in French. His father then sent him to the University of Göttingen to improve his German. He attained passable fluency within 6 months and a degree in art history, then traveled back to London via Wiesbaden, completing his formal education. Morgan went into banking in 1857 at the London branch of merchant banking firm Peabody, and a year later moved to New York City to join the banking house of Duncan, Sherman and Company. During the American Civil War, in an incident known as the Hull Carbine Affair, Morgan financed the purchase of 5,000 rifles from an army arsenal at $3.50 each, which were then resold to a field general for $22 each. The rifles were defective, and some shoot off the thumbs of the soldiers firing them. As a result, there was a congressional committee set up against him and sent to the federal judge, but somehow Morgan was exonerated. Morgan himself avoided serving during the war by paying a substitute $300 to take his place. From 1860 to 1864, as J. Pierpont Morgan & Company, he acted as agent in New York for his father's firm, renamed J.S. Morgan & Company. In 1871, he partnered with the Drexels of Philadelphia to form the New York firm of Drexel, Morgan & Company. At that time, Anthony J. Drexel became Pierpont's mentor at the request of his father Junius Morgan. After the death of Anthony Drexel, his mentor, the firm was rechristened as J.P. Morgan & Company in 1895, retaining close ties with Drexel & Company of Philadelphia, Morgan, Harges & Company of Paris, and J.S. Morgan & Company of London. By 1900 it was one of the world's most powerful banking houses, focused primarily on reorganizations and consolidations. Morgan had many partners over the years, such as George W. Perkins, but always remained firmly in charge. He often took over troubled businesses and reorganized their structures and management to return them to profitability, a process that became known as Morganization. His reputation as a banker and financier drew interest from investors to the businesses that he took over, and with each investor, he became more richer and powerful. In his ascent to power, Morgan focused on railroads, America's largest business enterprises. He gained control of the railroad business from Jay Gould and Jim Fisk in 1869, as he led the syndicate that broke the government financing privileges of Jay Cooke and then developed and financed a railroad empire by reorganization and consolidation in all parts of the United States. He raised large sums in Europe, but rather than participating solely as a financier, he helped the railroads reorganize and achieve greater efficiency. He fought speculators interested only in profit and built a vision of an integrated transportation system. After Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, Morgan set up conferences in 1889 and 1890 that brought together railroad presidents to help the industry follow the new laws and write agreements for the maintenance of public, reasonable, uniform and stable rates. The first of their kind, the conferences created a community of interest among competing lines, paving the way for the great mergers of the early 20th century. After his father's death in 1890, Morgan took control of J.S. Morgan & Company, renamed Morgan Grenfell & Company in 1910. He began talks with Charles M. Schwab, president of Carnegie Company, and businessman Andrew Carnegie in 1900, with the goal of buying Carnegie's steel business and merging it with several other steels, coal, mining, and shipping firms. After financing the creation of the Federal Steel Company, he merged it in 1901 with the Carnegie Steel Company and several other steel and iron businesses, forming the United States Steel Corporation. In 1901, U.S. Steel was the world's first billion-dollar company, with an authorized capitalization of $1.4 billion, much larger than any other industrial firm and comparable in size to the largest railroads. U.S. Steel's goals were to achieve greater economies of scale, reduce transportation and resource costs, expand product lines, and improve distribution to allow the United States to compete globally with the United Kingdom and Germany. Schwab and others claimed the company's size would enable it to be more aggressive and effective in pursuing distant international markets, globalization. But U.S. Steel was regarded as a monopoly by critics, as it sought to dominate not only steel, but the construction of bridges, ships, railroad cars and rails, wire, nails, and many other products. With U.S. Steel, Morgan captured 2/3 of the steel market, and Schwab was confident that the company would soon hold a 75% market share. To reduce expensive competition in the Midwest, Morgan and some men such as New York financier E. H. Harriman and Minnesota railroad builder James J. Hill created the Northern Securities Company to consolidate the operations of three of the region's most important railways: the Northern Pacific Railway, the Great Northern Railway, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. As stated earlier, not everyone loved their union or what they did. Especially President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt considered the giant merger bad for consumers. He hated the monopolization that Morgan and his team created. In 1902, Roosevelt ordered his Justice Department to sue to break it up, and in 1904 the Supreme Court dissolved the Northern Security Company and the railroads had to go their separate, competitive ways. Morgan did not lose money on the project, but his all-powerful political reputation suffered. Some say there are always opportunities in crisis, and J.P. Morgan was blessed with the gift of recognizing opportunities in failures. Morgan had saved America's economy from falling twice. Not everyone can boast of saving and financing a country's economy twice. The first time was when the Federal Treasury was nearly out of gold in and at the depths of the Panic of 1893. Morgan had put forward a plan for the federal government to buy gold from his and European banks, but it was declined in favor of a plan to sell bonds directly to the general public to overcome the crisis. Morgan was sure there was not enough time to implement such a plan, so he demanded and eventually obtained a meeting with Grover Cleveland, where he claimed the government could default that day if they didn't do something. Morgan came up with a plan to use an old Civil War statute that allowed Morgan and the Rothschilds to sell gold directly to the U.S. Treasury, 3.5 million ounces, to restore the Treasury surplus in exchange for a 30-year bond issue. This saved the Treasury and the economy and granted them a breathing space. The second episode is known as the Panic of 1907. The Panic of 1907 was a financial crisis that almost crippled the American economy. Major New York banks were on the verge of bankruptcy, and there was no mechanism to rescue them until Morgan stepped in to help resolve the crisis. Morgan met with the nation's leading financiers in his New York mansion, where he forced them to devise a plan to meet the crisis. James Stillman, president of the National City Bank, also played a central role. Morgan organized a team of bank and trust executives which redirected money between banks, secured further international lines of credit, and bought up the plummeting stocks of healthy corporations. A delicate political issue arose regarding the brokerage firm of Moore & Schley, which was deeply involved in a speculative pool in the stock of the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. You see, Moore & Schley had guaranteed over $6 million of the Tennessee Coal and Iron, TCI, stock for loans among the Wall Street banks. The banks had called the loans, and the firm could not pay. If Moore & Schley should fail, 100 more failures would follow, and then all Wall Street might go to pieces. Morgan decided they had to save Moore & Schley. TCI was one of the chief competitors of U.S. Steel, and it owned valuable iron and coal deposits. Morgan controlled U.S. Steel, and he decided it had to buy the TCI stock from Moore & Schley. Morgan sent Gary to see President Theodore Roosevelt, who promised legal immunity for the deal. U.S. Steel thereupon paid $30 million for the TCI stock, and the TCI company was saved. The announcement had an immediate effect. By November 7, 1907, the panic was over. Morgan again had saved and financed the economy. Vowing never to let it happen again, and realizing that in a future crisis there was unlikely to be another J. Morgan, in 1913 banking and political leaders, led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, devised a plan that resulted in the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. While conservatives in the progressive era hailed Morgan for his civic responsibility, his strengthening of the national economy, and his devotion to the arts and religion, others viewed him as one of the central figures in the system it rejected. Morgan redefined conservatism in terms of financial prowess coupled with strong commitments to religion and high culture. Enemies of banking attacked Morgan for the terms of his loan of gold to the federal government in the 1895 crisis, and, together with writer Upton Sinclair, they attacked him for the financial resolution of the Panic of 1907. They also attempted to attribute to him the financial ills of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. In December 1912, Morgan testified before the Pujo Committee, a subcommittee of the House Banking and Currency Committee. The committee ultimately concluded that a small number of financial leaders was exercising considerable control over many industries. The partners of J.P. Morgan & Company and directors of First National and National City Bank controlled aggregate resources of $22.245 billion, which Louis Brandeis, later a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, compared to the value of all the property in the 22 states west of the Mississippi River. But let's be honest, they can only say that after they were saved by the very man they accuse. Pretty sure they missed him during the Great Depression. Even though J.P. Morgan was hailed as a genius or a god in the financial market, he was still human. Morgan did not always invest well, as several failures demonstrated. In 1900, the inventor Nikola Tesla convinced Morgan he could build a transatlantic wireless communication system that would outperform the short-range radio wave-based wireless telegraph system then being demonstrated by Guglielmo Marconi. Morgan agreed to give Tesla $150,000, which is equivalent to $4,666,200 in 2020, to build the system in return for a 51% control of the patents. Almost as soon as the contract was signed, Tesla decided to scale up the facility to include his ideas of terrestrial wireless power transmission to make what he thought was a more competitive system. But it didn't please J.P. Morgan as well as Tesla. Morgan considered Tesla's changes and requests for the additional amounts of money to build it as a breach of contract and refused to fund the changes. With no additional investment capital available, the project at Wardenclyffe was abandoned in 1906 and never became operational. But Morgan always pushed on, breaking limits and boundaries and making history. Morgan died while traveling abroad on March 31, 1913, just shy of his 76th birthday. He died in his sleep at the Grand Hotel Plaza in Rome, Italy. His body was brought back to America aboard the SS France, a French line passenger ship. Flags on Wall Street flew at half-staff, and in an honor usually reserved for heads of state, the stock market closed for 2 hours when his body passed through New York City. His body was brought to lie in his home the first night of arrival in New York City. His remains were interred in the Cedar Hill Cemetery in his birthplace of Hartford, Connecticut. His son, John Pierpont Jack Morgan Jr., inherited the banking business. He gave his mansion and large book collections to the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. His estate was worth $68.3 million, $1.39 billion in today's dollars based on CPI, or $25.2 billion based on share of GDP, of which about $30 million represented his share in New York and Philadelphia banks. The value of his art collection was estimated at $50 million. Over the course of his career on Wall Street, J.P. Morgan spearheaded the formation of several prominent multinational corporations including U.S. Steel, International Harvester, and General Electric, which subsequently fell under his supervision. He and his partners also held controlling interests in numerous other American businesses including Aetna, Western Union, Pullman Car Company, and 21 railroads. Due to the extent of his dominance over U.S. finance, Morgan exercised enormous influence over the nation's policies and the market forces underlying its economy. During the Panic of 1907, he organized a coalition of financiers that saved the American monetary system from collapse. As the progressive era's leading financier, J.P. Morgan's dedication to efficiency and modernization helped transform the shape of the American economy. Adrian Wooldridge characterized Morgan as America's greatest banker. We hope you enjoyed this informative video. Don't forget to hit the like button and the bold red subscribe button to subscribe to our channel for more great videos like this one. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.